Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 20, The Unification of Greater Frankia. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, several Austrasian dukes plotted to assassinate Childebert and seize power by ruling through his very young sons. However, Guntram learned of the plot and warned Childebert. The dukes were executed and their supporters were exiled from court. Believing that Fredegund as regent of Neustria was a threat, Childebert and Guntram made a formal alliance between their two kingdoms. Unfortunately, a marriage alliance between Austrasia and Hispania fell through, so Guntram attempted to invade but was badly defeated. This defeat had consequences since the Bretons began to raid Guntram's lands. Aside from the external conflict, Guntram had to deal with a revolt by nuns led by two former princesses, a power struggle over control of an influential abbey. The revolt lasted for over a year until the situation was finally resolved. Finally, Fredegund died. Her son Clothar was too young to rule, so Austrasia and Burgundy forced him to sign over most of his lands. When Theudebert turned 15 in 601, he received formal control of Austrasia, so Brunhild moved to Burgundy to serve as regent for her grandson Theuderic. Theudebert soon married, choosing Bunhild, oddly enough a former slave of Brunhild. Theuderic was more content to have Brunhild rule, presumably so he could concentrate on impregnating his concubines. One gave birth to a son named Sigebert in 602, another concubine produced a son in 603, and other sons named Corbus and Medovic would soon appear. This large-scale production of sons seems to have been encouraged by Brunhild. Her grandson had sufficient heirs but no queen, so she could continue to rule. In 605, Clothar attacked Burgundy in order to regain Paris and Soissons. Naturally, this invasion should have failed quickly since Theudebert had promised to support his younger brother. Reinforcements did arrive from Austrasia, but Theudebert quickly negotiated a peace with Clothar and marched home. Theuderic did win, but his mayor of the palace died in the battle. The two brothers had never been especially close, and this lack of support did not improve the situation. Worse, Theudebert's nobles seemed to have tired of Bunhild, since she was murdered in 610. Theudebert quickly remarried, and his new queen gave birth to a son. The same year as Bunhild's death, Theudebert lured his brother into a trap and forced him to sign a treaty that handed over much of his land. The cause for the sudden break between the siblings is unknown, but sadly not out of character for the Merovingians. Once again, it is worth asking why the Franks were able to focus their energy on fighting each other and not worry about their neighbors. Honestly, the neighbors were often more worried about the Franks, and this was especially true of the Lombard kingdom. Given the danger from the Franks and the increased imperial activity in the south, Othari clearly felt the need for a marriage alliance, so he married Theodelinda, the daughter of Gadibald, Duke of Bavaria. Actually, Bavaria had already aided the Lombards against the Franks, since the expansionist Franks were seen as a threat to everyone. Even so, the marriage would both strengthen the alliance and improve Othari's status among the Lombards. When Othari died in 590, he was succeeded by Agilulf, Duke of Turin, possibly on the recommendation of Theodelinda. Anyway, she married him. That same year, Emperor Maurice began an aggressive campaign against the Lombards, but Agilulf was able to unite many of the Lombard dukes under his rule. As ever, the unification process undoubtedly relied more on force than persuasion, but several smaller duchies submitted. Peace was negotiated with the Franks, enabling Agilulf to finally pressure Friuli, one of the most powerful duchies, to submit. It appears that Agilulf modeled his new kingdom on the kingdom of Theuderic, king of the Ostrogoths. Milan, the old imperial capital, became his capital, and he held ceremonies in the circus. His court attracted members of the old Roman aristocracy, well, the ones who had survived the repeated invasions. Apparently the marriage did not produce an heir, so Agilulf held a ceremony in the circus where Theodelinda's son Adaloald was made co-ruler. What about the Visigoth kingdom, you ask? There had been several revolts near the end of Leovigild's reign and in the beginning of Recared's reign, so Leovigild's dynasty did not have the full support of the nobility. Finally, Recared's son Leova was overthrown in 603. A noble named Witteric became king, but he was assassinated in 610. His successor Gundamar only lasted a year or two. Given the constant instability, the kingdom should have been a target for an invasion by one of its neighbors, either the Franks or the Empire. Geography likely prevented a Frankish invasion, but the Empire was busy with internal issues. Speaking of the Empire, Maurice had ruled well initially, but the empty treasury forced him to be strict with the remaining funds, which provoked a revolt by the army on the Danube frontier. The soldiers were led by a centurion named Phacas, but they did not make him emperor, which seems strange. Instead, they wanted to make either Maurice's son Theodosius or his father-in-law Germanus emperor, but Phacas had different ideas. After a few people had been assassinated, notably Maurice and his sons, Phacas reluctantly accepted the heavy responsibility of the imperial throne. While Maurice had provoked the revolt with his unnecessary stinginess, he had been the first emperor to look at the expanded empire and adapt the imperial structure to match its size. Recognizing that Carthage and Ravenna were too distant to be ruled directly from Constantinople, Maurice had established a system where each region was ruled by an exarch who reported directly to the emperor, but they had greater power than an ordinary governor. The region led by an exarch would be called an exarchate. This system was a new approach to administration, since all civilian administration was placed under the authority of the military commander, not for a brief period during a crisis, but permanently. The exarchate of Ravenna was composed of Ravenna and Rome, linked by a narrow, heavily defended road across the Apennine Mountains. The term exarch is probably equivalent to the more modern term viceroy. So, how would Maurice's successor manage the empire? Well, Phacas proved to be inept and cruel. Even worse, Khosrow used the death of Maurice as a pretext to invade. Despite the genuine threat of a Persian invasion, Phacas murdered his best general Narses to prevent the development of a rival, and the other generals proved unable to stop the Persian advance. In addition, the Slavs and the Avars continued to attack despite generous payments. The instability did not lead to support for the new emperor, so rumors of coups spread, which resulted in more waves of executions. Finally, Heraclius, exarch of Carthage, revolted in 608. However, he moved slowly and carefully, sending an army to march to Egypt and a fleet to sail to Thessalonica. Each force grew steadily, so when Heraclius finally arrived in Constantinople in 610, Phacas was handed over by his own followers and killed. Basically, the empire was busy. Okay, back to Frankia. Unsurprisingly, a year after being forced to sign an unfair treaty, Theuderic made an alliance with his cousin Clothar. The cousins marched against Theudebert in 612 and captured Cologne, the royal treasury, and the king himself. Given the conflict, it should not be a surprise that Theudebert did not leave his brother's presence alive. Even so, the family dispute took a nasty turn when Theuderic ordered one of his soldiers to take his young nephew Merovic and smash his head against a nearby rock, thus eliminating the last rival for the throne of Austrasia. In exchange for the alliance, Clothar received the lands he had lost more than 2 decades earlier. So, Theuderic, king of Burgundy, had occupied Austrasia. Clothar was unlikely to challenge his cousin, so Theuderic could focus on the hard work of strengthening his control over Austrasia. That presumption would be logical, but incorrect. In 613, a single year after his great victory over his brother, Theuderic gathered an army and marched on Neustria. The situation was not favorable for Clothar, but Theuderic fell ill with dysentery and died in Metz. Still, Theuderic had several sons. So, which of Theoderic's illegitimate sons would inherit what? Obviously, Brunhild would be regent again. She definitely had the experience, and it would only be for a few years. Promise. Also, Burgundy and Austrasia would remain united under Sigebert II. A Burgundian noble named Warnachar was appointed Sigebert's mayor of the palace, and he called the nobles of both kingdoms to an assembly to crown Sigebert. Great. Everything was settled. Not exactly. Some elderly rulers don't know when to retire. Their instincts are no longer as sharp, but worse, a younger generation of leaders becomes frustrated as it becomes apparent that they will never have an opportunity to advance. Unsurprisingly, this frustration was especially strong in Austrasia, which had been conquered by Burgundy. Faced with rule by an underaged, illegitimate Burgundian, overseen by an elderly queen who was nearly 70, a group of nobles led by a bishop named Arnulf and a noble named Pippin decided to invite Clothar to rule them. It needs to be stressed that Austrasia had been Brunhild's home for most of her long life, so she had clearly overstayed her welcome. Regardless, a few rebellious nobles could have been handled, but Warnachar began to suspect that Brunhild had decided to replace him with someone more cooperative, so he contacted Clothar as well. Unaware of his betrayal, Warnachar was placed in command of the army that marched out to face Clothar, although the army was officially commanded by Sigebert. Obviously, the king should be present, but all three of his brothers were there as well, so it seems strange that Brunhild would risk all of her great-grandsons in one location. When it became clear that Warnachar had betrayed them, 10-year-old Childebert managed to flee, but Sigebert, Corbus, and Merovic were captured. Brunhild and her granddaughter Theodelia were also captured. The royal family was brought to a field near the Vingien River where Clothar was camped with his army. Sigebert and Corbus were promptly executed. Apparently Merovic was spared because he was Clothar's godson, so he was sent to be raised by a noble in Nuestria. Given the life expectancy of Merovingian males, Clothar may have wanted to keep a young nephew in reserve. His cousin Theodelia was sent to a convent as expected, and it would have been natural to have Brunhild sent to a convent as well to live out her remaining years. However, Brunhild would receive a harsher sentence. The key factor was probably fear. All of the powerful men that supported Clothar had grown up watching Brunhild survive coups and defeats and assassination attempts. As the stories became exaggerated, they must have felt that it did not matter if she seemed helpless, locked safely away in a convent. She would escape, and the struggle would start over again. Warnachar, Arnulf, and Pippin all pushed for her to be executed. So Brunhild was put on trial and accused of responsibility for the murder of 10 kings. I need to repeat this. 10 kings. These accusations must have appeared bizarre since she was accused of the death of her husband Sigebert, the suicide of her second husband Merovic, the murder of Fredegund's stepson Clovis, Clothar's own baby son, and even the deaths of her 3 great-grandsons several days earlier. She was declared guilty and deposed as queen. After she was beaten for 3 days, she was paraded sitting backwards on a camel and then tied to a post and a horse to be torn apart. The story of Brunhild's execution by being pulled apart by horses may be a fiction, but Clothar may have been honoring his mother. Or the nobles of Austrasia may have wanted revenge against a foreigner who had served endlessly as regent. Clothar was now sole king of Frankia, but he owed this throne to powerful men, and these men wanted something in return. So Clothar held the Council of Paris in October 614, which confirmed that the kingdoms of Austrasia, Nuestria, and Burgundy would remain separate, each governed by its own mayor of the palace. The mayor of the palace ran the kingdom because the administration was basically the court, which was based in the palace. So it would be more accurate to view the mayor of the palace as the governor or prime minister. Who would become the new mayors? Warnachar naturally continued as mayor in Burgundy, but the position was transformed into a lifetime position rather than a position that depended on the favor of the king. Duke Pippin was appointed mayor of Austrasia, and he arranged a marriage alliance with his ally, Bishop Arnulf, where his daughter married Arnulf's son. The following year, Arnulf was rewarded with the bishopric of Metz, the capital of Austrasia, in recognition of his administrative ability and his genuine piety. After stating his control over all of Frankia, Clothar reassured the nobles of each region that he would respect their local customs, would not levy any new taxes, and would leave the local nobles responsible for maintaining order. Interesting. It is not a surprise that Clothar made no official mention of Brunhild or her sons or her grandsons when he discussed previous taxes, even though he did mention his uncles. However, he never dedicated a church to his mother or even commissioned a poem. Honestly, this erasure is unfair. It is impossible to know now whether or not Fredegund was guilty of all of the many murders she has been blamed for, but she did keep the kingdom together long enough for Clothar to survive to adulthood. It is almost as if he resented his mother for being a capable ruler. Certainly, later chroniclers demonized both women, blaming their rivalry for the civil wars within Greater Frankia, as if those wars were an isolated, tragic interlude in a period of family harmony. The only times there were not civil wars within Greater Frankia were when Greater Frankia had a single ruler and the Franks expanded, or more accurately, conquered outwards. 4 years later, Warnachar died, so Clothar asked the nobles of Burgundy to recommend a successor, but they apparently preferred to be ruled directly, which sounds a little unlikely. The nobles of Austrasia were clearly more independent-minded than their peers in Burgundy, since in 622 they asked Clothar for their own king and received his son Dagobert, who would rule Austrasia as a sub-kingdom. Moreover, they received their own law code, distinct from the law code granted to Nuestria. It may seem strange that the Franks of Austrasia wanted their own law code, but the two regions were culturally different, since Nuestria spoke Latin and Austrasia spoke Frankish. Clearly, the cultural differences remained strong if the people of Austrasia still viewed themselves as separate from Nuestria a century after the region had been conquered by Clovis. In 628, Clothar died, and Dagobert smoothly succeeded his father as king of Nuestria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. So, who would replace Dagobert as sub-king of Austrasia? Apparently, no one. His brother Chadebert protested, but was consoled with lands in Aquitaine. Unfortunately, Chadebert died in 631, followed soon after by his son, once again leaving Dagobert as the sole claimant to Greater Frankia. Since Dagobert had a son, Theudebert, he was appointed king of Austrasia in 632, even though he was 2 years old, while Dagobert focused on Nuestria. A year later, Clovis, another son, was born to a different wife. Apparently, the nobles of Austrasia were unenthusiastic about the prospect of reunification with Nuestria, since Dagobert announced that he would follow the wishes of the nobles of Nuestria. Therefore, his son Clovis would inherit Nuestria and Burgundy, while Austrasia, which had roughly the same population and territory, would be ruled by Theudebert. This division presumably satisfied the respective nobles, but was probably viewed as theoretical, since Dagobert was still a relatively young man. Still, the Greater Kingdom remained peaceful. Frankia was a large kingdom, and the sub-kings were toddlers. So, who would actually rule the separate regions? Would Dagobert rely on his father's trusted advisors? Nope. As I already mentioned, Arnulf was genuinely pious, so he had entered a monastery when King Clothar died. 4 years later, Pippin was replaced as mayor by the leader of a rival family, probably because Dagobert wanted to replace his father's advisors rather than listen to them complain, "Your father used to do things this way, blah blah blah." Then Dagobert died in 639. To sum up, following the deaths of Guntram and Childebert, the three kingdoms were ruled by children, although Fredegund was regent for her son Clothar in Neustria, and Brunhild was regent for her grandsons Theudebert in Austrasia and Theuderic in Burgundy. In theory, Theudebert and Theuderic could have combined against Clothar, but the brothers were more interested in fighting each other. Eventually, Theuderic allied with Clothar against his older brother and gained control of both Burgundy and Austrasia after killing Theudebert. While Clothar had gained some lands, he knew that Theuderic would soon decide to unite Greater Frankia under a single king, him. However, Theuderic died of something, leaving Brunhild regent for her great-grandson. Unfortunately, several powerful nobles in Austrasia decided that it was time for new leadership and allied with Clothar. Brunhild was executed, and Clothar became king of Greater Frankia. It appeared that Frankia would remain united since Clothar's son Dagobert refused to share power with his brother, but Dagobert died relatively young. So, who would rule Frankia? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.